One of the first rules of literary criticism is good books start with big explosions. And according to this book's a masterpiece. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any book. Today we'll be talking about Blackheart Man by Nalo Hopkinson, which came out last week, and I hope I'll be able to record it today without my neighbors starting renovating again, which happened last night. Anyway, let's talk about the book. It came out last week. It's Caribbean-inspired fantasy. It's really, really good. It's one of the best books I've read this year so far. It hit me in some unexpected places, and we'll talk about all of that in a moment. But we'll do the usual thing, which means I'll give you a quick synopsis where I tell you why you have to go and read it immediately, right now. Do it right now. And then I'll have a bit more beer, and you go and read the book, and after like 2 minutes, much less, you'll come back, and I'll come back, and we'll talk about details. We do a bit of like analysis and stuff, and why I think it's so brilliant, and that may involve spoilers, hence the quick beer break. Don't worry, it's not that long of a book. You can do it in a couple of seconds. I'm pretty sure. There's a pause button out there, I think. Anyway, otherwise, I mean, if you don't mind spoilers, you can just like keep watching. So, let's do it, shall we? Blackheart Man is a fantasy story. It's a fast-paced fantasy story set on a fictional island in a fictional world that does, however, inspire, or not inspire, like reference or remind some people of the Caribbean in some way or other, which is obviously on point. It follows one Vikosi as he has to sort of come to terms with the fact that a former colonial power is trying to reinstate their imperialist rule over his homeland, those being the islands that he lives on. That's the framing narrative. Within that, however, there's obviously a lot of other stuff going on because our young Vikosi is in all kinds of other trouble at the same time. So that's sort of like the stuff you can get from the back cover, so I don't consider it spoilers. Why do I think you should go and read this book right now? I think there's numerous reasons. One, it's fun. It does actually have a really interesting, fast plot. It makes a lot of fun to read that book. It's a lot of fun to read that book, trust me. It also goes some unexpected places, has some pretty dark twists in between, but all of those make sense within the structure of the novel. It's a well-structured novel. It's an incredibly well-written novel about some really interesting, sometimes fun characters. And it shows a really interesting world that is Caribbean in influence. It does not turn the Caribbean experience into like, all paradise or a tourist advertisement. It does deal with a lot of these experiences in a fantastic setting, in a fantasy language. And yeah, if that's something you have always wanted to read, go read this book. If this is something you have not known that you want to read, you still should still go and read this book, because it does all of these things really well. It'll surprise you in all kinds of ways, and it will certainly leave you touched in some unexpected places as well. And I think that's something we don't get too often in fantasy. Obviously, over the last couple of years, fantasy has moved away from just medieval Europe, but the Caribbean is still somewhat underappreciated, I would say, within the fantasy world. So I think this might just be the thing you wanted to read. I mean, I think it is. So go read it. It does get dark. There is obviously imperialism happening here. People will die, so there is definitely some darkness here. This is an adult book, despite the fact that, it has a lot of like positive energy in parts. So be aware of that. No incredibly brutal stuff that I would call trigger warnings on, but be aware, this is still adult fantasy in a lot of ways. So there's that. Now I'll drink and you read the book, and then we talk about why I think it's all so incredibly well done. Ready? Perfect. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It certainly stuck with me, and I'm going to reread it. I'm pretty sure of that. It's just so good. Now let's go through this in several layers and several chapters. We'll start out with the the language, the style, and how that informs the world, and informs the world building, and informs the novel. And then we'll move on to some other aspects. We move on to the world building, and then we move on to one of the key aspects that kind of springs from that world building and from the narrative structure and everything else, and then we'll be done. So let's start with style. This book is very much informed by oral storytelling, which makes a lot of sense when you look at, the cultural background this is sort of trying to evoke. Now, I'm obviously no expert in any way, shape, or form of Caribbean culture. As a German white boy, I know nothing about it, but it's certainly something you can see with other authors coming from this tradition, that meaning like other stories told by Nalo Hopkinson and the books by Marlon James that I have read, which is like all my background from this. But like having an oral tradition is important. So one of the things here is that this is a story that is told. It is told to us by someone. It's sort of hinted at where, and I'm not going too much into the details, but it's a story that is told to us about other people. Something in this oral storytelling tradition is important here. But, and this is sort of where stuff gets interesting, it's not just using that, what you kind of get from your average, like, unreliable first-person narrator stories that we can get in wherever. It moves beyond that because it is also a story about stories and how stories are told and vary over time, with the whole idea of Bikosi having to assemble a book with different stories about the past of his homeland being one plot point, which leaves us with several different stories about the same events in the past that we need that we as readers also try to figure out while Bikosi is figuring out what is happening or what happened in reality. And all of these stories, once again, and this is the important part, right? They make up the idea of who the inhabitants of these islands think they are, who they believe they are, because narratives are what holds us together. That's how we construct identity, through stories. And stories can be told and can be retold and can be changed over time, and it's important to be aware of that. And that informs how we use language as well, and how language shifts over time with the stories that we tell, with the way we tell stories and so forth, which I think is one of the wonderful things that makes this book so powerful. One of the small bits that I found really interesting in that regard is, of course, the birds, right? The way language shifts, because one of the narratives calls the birds hummingbirds, but in the rest of the story, the birds are called colibris. And now those are sort of maybe the same bird or maybe not, but there's a hint that something in the past shifted and the language shifted with it. The stories that were told shifts with it as well. And that is something that will come back again and again throughout the story. So this is the first point that I wanted to look at, is how the storytelling, the oral nature, the oral tradition that informs the way this works, with like all these different tales woven in that are sometimes just quick bits about something. Sometimes there are larger narratives that are told to Vikosi. All of these things make up the story. This is a story that is pulled together from other stories, and that's how oral traditions work. And it references stuff that obviously everyone on the island knows about, but we as readers have to figure out later on through context. So that's the first part. The next part is the language that is used. Now, as I said, this is obviously a Caribbean influenced setting, and it uses a language that is very much influenced by different Caribbean patois. It's, as far as I can tell, now obviously no expert, it is not any specific Caribbean patois. It's more like a mix of different bits and pieces, in the same way that, say, recently a novella by Paolo Bacigalupi had a almost Italian language in it. It's sort of a mix of those things. And once again, that is important because it, on the one hand, gives us sort of like a feel for the island, for the place, for the setting. It also kind of makes it clear that this is not exactly our world. It's slightly twisted away from it. It does invoke, especially when we talk about your different words being used by different groups within the island. It invokes that plurality that is so important here that we'll come back to later on again. So having this very unique language patois being subtly woven into the story, right? At the beginning, there's a few words, but over time, when people talk to each other, when people talk about each other and so forth, over time, there will be more and more of it. And that's a great way for us as readers to sort of be slowly pushed into this, and by the end of the story, we don't have to figure out what pickens are. It's just like, yeah, that's kids, right? We don't have to think about this word. It doesn't need a glossary of made-up fantasy words, because it's slowly eased into this very specific language that Nalo Hopkinson chose for this specific book. And that is something that obviously extends, and this is where we move over from language to world building, that also extends to the world building. Because a lot of the parts about like how this society works, how this world works, is also, I mean, all of it is introduced through stuff that is happening over time, slowly. We'll never get like any explanation of this is this and this and this and this because of. We don't get any long explanations about anything. It's just presented to us as this world, but over time, more and more things are sort of contextualized by other stuff that is happening. The way we realize this is a society that doesn't use money. Yes, we get later on, we get like explanations on why this is the case. In the beginning, we don't even notice about it, and then it's about, they stamp a mark, and it's about standing within the society. It's something that, you know, any of those of us who have read stuff like David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years, or any other books about like how societies do without money and not use just barter, because that's also not how those sort of exchanges work, can sort of notice in the beginning. Other people will probably recognize it after a while. And I think the way these bits and pieces are slowly introduced, the way that we'll learn that the first captain that someone talks about is a woman, and later on we learn that men are not allowed to, or don't become captains of ships in this society. Which then leads us to the idea that, yes, this is in parts almost matriarchal as a society. It's not we'll just like flip a patriarchy on its head. It's slowly introduced that there are gender roles in this society, and they are different from ours, but it's something we have to construct as readers through context. And that's a very, very powerful way of evoking a sense for a setting. I would say a much more powerful way, much more effective way than just having info dumps, basically. It's something that we have obviously seen with other authors that have done similar things. Stephen Erickson certainly does it in The Malazan Book of the Fallen. In a different way, I would say Gene Wolfe does it in Book of the New Sun. There's a lot of books that do that, but it's incredibly well done here, simply because we have sort of like an image, and this is why I think it works so well. Most of us, even those of us who have never even, left our small Western European country, not me, I've been to other parts of Western Europe, but never left the continent, right? We all have images that once we hear the first words of this text, we're like, this is Caribbean. And we all have images of the Caribbean that are, depending on like what we have done before and so forth, very different. So there is sort of this sort of weird conflict in our brain, sort of like a bit of cognitive dissonance that we have to constantly overcome to realize this world is different. And that can lead us to evaluating the differences between something that is almost like our world and something that is very much not like our world, and something that is our world. And we can sort of figure out where the differences are and look at these differences in society. And there's a bunch here, and I think they are all very, very interesting to look at, because once again, all of this will come together later on. So let's look at it. Yes, there are elements of a matriarchy in this society. Women do have power. Not all roles are specifically just for women. Apparently ship's captains are, being cacique, which, once again is a word that people from the Caribbean, especially in this case, I think, I don't know about Jamaica, but I definitely know about Haiti or Dominican Republic, that those places, I know that the term cacique is very much like, it's a bit of a warlord, strongman kind of thing. In this case, he or she is the ruler. And at the beginning, the cacique of the main city is a woman. But at the end of the text, it's a man. So that we can recognize this is not just a gender-specific role, whereas ship's captain seems to be one. We have those sort of like these slight differences. So there are... it's a very unique sort of society in that regard. And then we learn that around this area, a lot of marriages are of one woman and two co-husbands. don't necessarily have to be that, but a lot of them are, which opens up an interesting dynamic. So for us to look at, like, polyamory seems to be in some way, shape, or form accepted in the society. And I think this is another very important party, because these things are often like introduced and we're like, oh, this is fine, and then we see other people doing different things, and concepts that we slowly adapt to in our world right now in the West, when we realize that things that have always been around, that are sort of slowly moving into what we might call almost mainstream-ish awareness, are very well embedded in here without becoming, we also have to do this to showing that they are deeply embedded in this society. There are, within the world, historical reasons why certain things are in certain ways. The way that, say, different forms of homosexuality are just accepted, are once again shown partly through these stories that are told. It's like, this is how these things evolved over time. This is a society that is just like slightly different from ours, possibly slightly better from ours, and we'll come back to that in a moment as well. Once again, the way the economy functions, with standing, with trusting each other, in a way, is something that is slowly introduced over time. And all of these bits and pieces, I think, fit marvelously together in a way that I've rarely seen in world building done. And once again, this is a short book. This is like 400 pages, right? This is not, 10 big books as in Malazan, right? This is very condensed in a way, and it still works really well in that regard. And that's very, very powerful. So let's move on, because while this society does have all these aspects, it is still not a perfect paradise, right? You may think, from me being who I am, that I'm like, God, everything's fine in this society, no money and free love, and it's all brilliant. It's not, and this is, I think, the strength that once again comes here, because there is racism within this world. You have these different groups that all are sort of make up this society from different backgrounds, and some of them are called deserters, because they, and they are treated as second class in a lot of ways. And this is something that you can see when you read other books about the Caribbean, that there's clear stratification between different groups that have ended up in these societies out of different reasons. You read something like Book of Night Women by Mullen James. You have this weird, like, series between, like, English planters, and you have Irish that are definitely second class, and then you have black slaves, and there's like all these different, and the question is, like, how does that sort of like build a society that is a better society from a lot of places that we have right now that have been in our world's history of the Caribbean? How do you sort of do that without losing all these, like, problems that still come with this being a post-colonial society in a lot of ways? And the way this is handled, I think, is really well done. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. But, like, I just wanted to point out that not everything is just wonderful here. There is obviously elitism in this, the way that people from some minorities, or like some groups of this society, are not allowed to advance to certain posts and are treated as second class. The way that foreigners are definitely treated with a lot of skepticism. They are rooted in history, because having a fight against your imperial overlords will can certainly turn you slightly xenophobic in some ways, or at least skeptical towards newcomers. And all of this makes sense, but it shows that this is not just a perfect utopia. It just, like, feels somewhat utopian compared to where we live right now in a lot of ways. And I found this really interesting. So let's move towards the last key thing that I think is important here. And that's our main character, Vikosi. See, one of the key themes of this book, I think, is sort of the question, or the dissonance between the individual and a larger collective in a lot of ways. And Vikosi is obviously personifying that, and personifying that travel from that one end to the other end of that spectrum, or at least understanding parts of it. Because at the beginning, he's very much an individualist. He doesn't care about anything. He wants to save the world. He wants glory. He wants to be the hero. And throughout the story, he's constantly confronted with the fact that being so obsessed with being the hero, being I guess in a lot of ways your typical male role model in a lot of ways from like our perspective, right? Being the one who does the things, who saves the world, who deserves adulation for that, right? All of that is constantly questions when he has to realize that some groups are not treated as others, and that deserter is actually, an insult, a racial slur in this world, and having to come to terms with that, and sometimes realizing bits and pieces of that, sometimes not realizing it. And through his drive to become or to be a hero, to save his world, and his intentions are good within that framework, he constantly fails and he constantly fucks up and makes things worse and worse and worse and worse. Because this is a society, this is a network of people, and people rely on each other, and people need to be able to, look each other in the eye, be on a level playing field, respect each other, ask for help when they need it, accept help when it's given, help each other, and so forth. All of this is the true solution to these problems, which is something that we find out near the end. And because he finally figures out sort of near the end, when he has this idea of how to, help his son, or not son, but in this case, friend, at the end, to not become the embodiment of the goddess, when he has to ask other people to help him with, calculating things that he can't do. We all know that he can't calculate, because that's how the story begins, with him miscalculating his explosions that he does to save the world, and all of that acceptance coming near the end, I think, is an important and powerful thing. And this is, I think, what makes the story work so well, and this is sort of where I tie this back to the beginning, because the story that is told to us by unreliable narrators, so to speak, is a story of different stories, of different perspectives put together. It is, in the way it is told already, a network of stories. And the lesson is, we all have to become parts of these networks. And this is where style and world building and plot all reinforce each other at the end, which makes it so powerful and so effective. And that's why I think it's such a powerful thing. Now, I'll just talk about like 2 or 3 personal things before we leave, and then I'll leave you to whatever else will happen. And I think, here's the thing. I'm a very toxically masculine person in a lot of ways, and I found so much of myself in Vikosi that I really cried at the end, because I'm like, I've done a lot of dumb shit over the years and fucked up a lot of people's lives, because I have behaved very similarly. Obviously, I've not blown up any water reservoirs and, not sacrificed children out of my own cowardice, but I've certainly done a lot of dumb things over the years, because I was unable to see myself as part of a network of people, of accepting help, of asking for help where I needed it, of any of these things. And I've also been, very much an ADHD person who always goes where their curiosity drives them, and is flighty in all kinds of ways. So I've seen a lot of myself in there. And hopefully the book has taught me to, or at least shown me on an emotional level, something that I obviously know on a rational level. And I think that's where I think fiction like this can be incredibly powerful. And I really, really love that. Beyond that, the way that gender fluidity is embodied in this book is another one that I absolutely loved. It's not something I personally have a lot of experience with, but the way it was so natural, it's like, this sometimes happens and people find out at some point, and that's totally fine, and so forth. It's just very wholesome in today's climate, and I just wanted to point out that it's done once again in a wonderful way, because it is once again very much embedded in this world. There's a lot of these small bits and pieces that I found that's really, really interesting, and the way that we find out that something went wrong in the past, something terrible happened to sort of kick out the imperial overlords, but during this conflict, a lot of things also got wrong, and we learn that something is weird, like the colibri and hummingbird thing. And of course, there's a small bit where we learn that caimans in this world, that this one caiman is different than other caimans because it has only one tail. And I'm like, wait a second. And I had to go back. It's like, that's what's written there. It's like, wait, do caimans have 2 tails? What kind of world is this in? And I really, really appreciated the way this was handled. The way that the one sex scene is first a gay sex scene and then a threesome, I found really interesting. The way all of these bits and pieces once again fit together. I'm like, this is certainly an idea of like how the world could be if we would, not think of ourselves all the time as the hero and want hero narratives. And this, it's obviously also a criticism of, a lot of epic fantasy where we have heroes. And I know it's not heroes. It's people that try not to be heroes and try to do stuff together. And yeah, once again, this is a very, very powerful message. It's a very powerful book. I loved it. I hope you read it. I hope if you've read it, you loved it as much as I did. If so, or if you hated it, or whatever else, tell me down in the comments. Like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you feel like it. No pressures there. Just mostly talk about it, because I think we need to talk more about this book. It's a beautiful book. It's a wonderful book, and I'm excited. Anyway, I'll talk about something else tomorrow, and until then, thanks and cheers.